We're talking this week with one of my very favorite people to talk to. I don't get to do it very often, but every once in a while, he writes a great book and we get to sit down and have a conversation. I wish, though, that we talked all the time because this is someone I truly learn from every single time we have the chance to engage. Stan McChrystal, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Well, Suzanne, as always, it's a pleasure to be back with you. You're kind to have me.
Your latest book on character, Choices That Define a Life, has been getting a lot of buzz in the media, a lot of buzz actually probably in a lot of private conversations that folks are having these days. I'm wondering, what drove you to write this book?
Yeah, it's interesting because I had written my memoirs and several other books, and I was through writing books, and I was sitting in my living room where my wife Annie, who you know, Suzanne, we read, and I would interrupt her reading every so often and give her a good idea, my view on something in the world or something about life, and she would nod and smile. And then she said, write these down. And so I started writing the ideas down in a set of 800 to 1,000 word essays, basically. And then I gave them to her to call her bluff. I said, I wrote them. And she said, this is a book. And I said, no, it's not a book. But the reality was, what it had done is it captured what I'd been thinking about. In fact, the first title was going to be What I Think About the Things I Think About. Mm-hmm. And she said, that's a stupid title, and so that's not the title of the book. But what they do is they intersect at the question or the issue of character. Not intentionally. I didn't start to write a book about character. What I did was I was thinking about the things which were most important to me now at this point in my life. I'm 71 and, got that much experience behind me and hopefully some interesting things in front of me. But I've been thinking ever since I left the service much more deeply about things like philosophy and character. I have a little more time to focus on it. Plus, sometimes you need some experiences in life, some scar tissue, which force you to think about it. And so I'm at that point where I think that character is the most important thing. I think it always has been. But the reality is, I think you get busy in life. You're in your job, your profession, whatever it is you're trying to do, and you're trying to be good at this or successful at that, and you forget that the thing ultimately that counts is your character.
Yeah.
And people around you.
I was just going to say a shout out to Annie too, because it's not the first time you've written about her in your books, and I have had the pleasure of meeting her before, and she is a powerhouse. You should tell her she should write books as well, but we'll talk about that later. I do really, when you and I first sat down, Stan, I think we met 12 or 13 years ago. We were just launching the Cipher brief, and I came to you with the idea that I wanted to start a national security publication that kind of explained in better ways than what I thought we were getting as a society, context around the events of the day. And I remember one thing that you said to me, and you very eagerly said, I'd be happy to support it, but you said it cannot be political. And I thought, well, that's perfect, because that's how we also set out to build the Cipher brief from day one. But I'm going to be honest with you. 10 years later, we're living in an environment where everything is political, whether it's intended to be political or not. It almost seems like, and I'm sure you've had conversations like this, you can say something and it will be turned political and used against you. How are you thinking about character in environments like the one that we're in today?
Yeah, you make a great description of it, Suzanne, because you have done a wonderful job with the Cyber Brief, taking it forward, but we all have run into an environment that is almost disorienting. It is so partisan and in some cases so emotionally so. I think the word character is even charged right now, because if I was to say a person has good character, there's a certain number of people that would look at that word and say it's judgmental, it's applying other people don't have good character. They are good or bad. And, certainly all of us have our own definition of what we think character is. But in today's world, it has become almost binary. And so people on one side would say the people on the other side don't have good character and vice versa. And I think we need to step back and we need to say, okay, let's take a deep breath. Let's say, what do we think character actually is before we judge it?
Yeah.
And in the book, what I try to do is I say first that character is the essence of it. It's the most important thing about us and about our organizations, about our society. And it's measured by what we do, not by what we say. Because you can get out, you can write, you can protest something. But the reality is your actions define what you actually value.
Yeah.
And so when I say that character is that essence, I go back to Thomas Paine's quote that says, reputation is what men know of us. Character is what, or think of us. Character is what gods and angels know of us. And so it's really this combination of your deeply held beliefs or convictions times the discipline you have to live up to them. Because people can say, this is what I believe. If they say, I believe in integrity, I am an honest person, but then in a moment of truth, that's not the way they behave, it's fair to go back and say, what's the honest measure of that person's integrity or their character? And so, but unfortunately, we use this in a way that starts with an idea that the speaker and the object that they're speaking about has a political view.
Yep, even if they don't.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. One of the things that I remember, I think it was shortly after your last book came out, we met in New York at the New York Stock Exchange and sat down and had a conversation. And I remember we had a conversation about Robert E. Lee. And you talk about the Civil War, actually, and use some of those anecdotes in the book as well when trying to convey some of these lessons, I guess, or ways of thinking about life, which are, by the way, it's a deeply personal book. And it's such a great, easy read because you get pulled in immediately as the reader and you feel like you're sitting in a room with you, Stan, to be honest. It's phenomenal. But can you kind of talk me through how your thinking about people like Robert E. Lee has changed and how you think that has impacted your character over the years?
Yeah. You know, I make no comparison to myself and anybody great, but I grew up mostly in Northern Virginia. I went to Washington Lee High School. When I went to West Point, I lived in Lee Barracks. Robert E. Lee was this icon at West Point. There were other generals and leaders who were depicted in statues and paintings, but Lee was separate. He was something above those. Nobody tried to be Robert E. Lee because he was too exalted to actually try to be. And so, for me, Lee was this almost an example that you work towards but never hope to reach. And you remember for the 150 years after the Civil War, even people from the North tended to separate Robert E. Lee from anything they didn't like about the South, and they would say he was a gentleman, he was an incredible leader, he was a great soldier. And so through my life, he was one of these iconic figures that unconsciously I wanted to try to emulate. And yet, he was complicated. He was complicated as a person. In fact, in his years at West Point, they referred to him as the Marble Man, not as a term of respect, but he was a little too stiff, some of his peers did. Regardless of that, he was an extraordinary military officer for 31 years for the United States Army. And yet, after 31 years, in 1861, when Virginia, his home state, made the decision to secede and join the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee made the decision to go with him. And I would argue, at the time, he knew that was wrong. Now, he's not here to defend himself, so it's unfair to me to be judgmental. But he certainly had experience with slavery. He also had spent 31 years, and his family before that, trying to build this nation as a united entity. And now suddenly, he joins a side and for the next few years leads forces trying to destroy it. In fact, he is the single general in American history who has killed the most American soldiers.
Oh, wow.
That's kind of a stunning
Yeah.
thing. But still, I had this reverence for him, and I had this painting that my wife had given me. She'd gotten me back when I was a lieutenant. It was a cheap painting. It was a sort of a fake oil painting, but I kept it up with pride. And then she told me in 2017 after Charlottesville that I should take it down. And I said, well, why? Because he's not political. He wasn't at Charlottesville. You remember the incidents there.
Yes.
And she goes, when people go to your office, they are going to perhaps unintentionally think that you support something you don't support. And
Slavery,
you know,
yes.
we argued about it for a month, and then I realized she was right, and I took it down because not only was she right, I was not thinking deeply enough or holistically enough about it because he had become a symbol. And in many ways, the real cautionary tale here is that here's a good man, a very good man and a very good soldier, but in the moment of truth, he takes the wrong fork in the road, in my opinion. Completely wrong. Not a little bit wrong, completely wrong. And if we step back and we go, well, it wasn't because he was stupid or evil, it was because he was human. And any of us can take the wrong fork at any time if we're not very thoughtful about it.
Yeah. It raises so many interesting questions for me, Stan, and just reading the book as well. And I don't know if you're watching the amazing Ken Burns documentary on PBS that came out this week on the American Revolution, but it does a fantastic job of telling those of us who haven't been to war how complicated these issues are. And George Washington, I think, is another example of someone who had incredible leadership, grit, determination. Lots of times he should have given up and walked away, and he didn't. And he tried to make sure that his troops would continue to follow him. But I wonder, you know, he also had slaves. He also had, I think, close to 200 slaves or something like that, if I recall correctly. I wonder if there's sort of like a how we'll be judged. And I know that was one of the things that you thought about a lot when you were writing this book, how we will all be judged. I wonder if there's like some kind of way of thinking about being in the time, or, you know, none of us is perfect. We do some things well, we don't do other things well. Like, it makes character a very complicated thing, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's funny because if you step away from it, you can oversimplify it. Yeah. If we think about most wars, there's this complicated lead up to it, political disagreements and other causes that contribute to this pretty big decision to start killing each other. In the first part of the war, it gets very simplified because you identify your side is right and the enemy is wrong. You go through this great effort to dehumanize your enemy. You know, think of the names we applied to them. In World War I, the Germans were the Huns. You know, in World War II, they were the Jerrys, the Krauts. The Japanese were the Nips. Anything we could do to make them a little more two-dimensional. Admiral Bull Halsey had a big billboard put up at the entrance to one of the harbors they were using in the Southwest Pacific during the war, and it said, "Kill Japs, kill Japs, kill more Japs." And you step back now and it's like, wow. But in the moment, it seemed absolutely rational message to be sending. Now, when you get in the war, as it goes along, the complexity comes right back. It's never gone away. But you start with this idea, we're right, they're wrong, and then as you get closer to it, you realize that, well, they may be wrong, but we're wrong at least a bit. And if you were on their side, if you had been raised in Virginia, had the background of most young Virginians, you probably would have joined the Confederate Army, at least statistically. And you wouldn't have felt like you were the bad guy. You wouldn't have felt like you were wrong any more than Al-Qaeda felt like they were wrong facing our forces. And if I had taken the life journey of any of the Al-Qaeda leaders, I'd probably be arrived to the same point. And then you say, okay, well, most wars are fought by two sides, neither of which is wrong, and therefore, by definition, neither of which is really completely right either. Yet, we are in a position where we often have to pick a side.
Yes.
And the further we go on in life, the more we realize that when we're picking a side, we're joining an imperfect side. We're not all right, and it's not going to come out all the way, and our conduct is not going to be always the best. And that makes it really hard because you can't stand on the sideline. There are times when you have to choose the least bad option.
Yeah, because there are no perfect options. You know, I really love the photo. For those of us watching on YouTube, the photo that's on the back of the book. If you're just listening on the podcast version, you've got to pick up the book and look, because it's a very thoughtful picture of you. I'm assuming contemplating all of these big questions. I'm curious, how do you think history will judge Stan McChrystal's character 100 years from now?
They'll probably forget me, so probably not a problem.
I don't think that's true.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't think a lot about that because I more think, what are my granddaughters going to think of me? Because they knew me, and they will be recent enough to my life to read. And you know, one of my granddaughters asked me, they did a tour of the Pentagon in like second grade. And she came back and she said, wow, you were in the Army. And that started this whole conversation. But I think the way I'm likely to be judged is my intentions were good. In some cases, the forces I was with were really effective. The Joint Special Operations Command, the Counterterrorist Force, I was at a pivotal or inflection moment. I was part of a transformation of that force, which turned out to have a big impact on how war was fought in the future. And so I think they will say he was not a visionary. They won't use that term, but they'll say he was part of a significant change. Then I think they'll look at things like Afghanistan and they'll say, but he was also part of an effort that, in the minds of many, was impossible from the outset. And yet he became someone that helped push it forward to failure. Now, that's a pretty damning judgment where they say, you know, my efforts, to the degree that they were good, just forestalled the inevitable. I'm not sure if I buy into that, but it's a fair assessment. And then I think they will likely say he tried to do the best he could, but everybody's flawed.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where I come down on Robert E. Lee.
I kind of feel like we're all in the same category when it comes to that, though. I mean, here's one of the things that I really love about the book, Stan, and why I really wanted to, even though it's been out for a little bit now, I really wanted to talk to you about it, is I feel like it's almost like a guide for each of us to think about our own character and how it changes based on where we are with our experience in life, like you've mentioned, based on the pressures and the stresses that we're under, how things can change. It's almost like a book that makes you think about yourself via you using all of your personal stories to really pull you in. And I think that's why it's so effective. I wonder what you think now, though, and this doesn't have to be a political question. When you think about America and 100 years from now and the character of America, what are those definitions of character for the country that you feel like are really critical?
Yeah. I worry about character in America, and the goal of the book is to start a national conversation on character. It's not to offer the solution. In fact, there are no solutions in the book, but what I do think I've done is I've identified a number of questions that turned out to be very relevant for me about character, and I offer them to others to use those or similar questions to think about it, because I think our great danger is if we don't think about it. And so I worry in America right now that we are confusing character with celebrity. or character with wealth, or character with power. We are watching people leverage things like information technology to have a reach and an influence over all of us that is way outsized to their actual contribution in terms of intellectual thought or anything else. And we become bewitched by their ability, and this includes politicians and some other celebrities and whatnot. We become bewitched by this, and we're accepting a lower or absence of character than we believe we have. And I describe this to people sometimes. You'll have a politician get up in front of a TV camera and lie. And the thing that's funny about it is they know they're lying, and they know we know they're lying. And yet we have this strange relationship that's developed that says, yeah, but they're politicians, so they're supposed to lie.
Yeah, for generations now.
Yeah, we've normalized something that is ridiculous, because if you're in a world where you have to rely on other people, if you can't rely on them telling the truth, then there's no trust for anything. How do you know if somebody's packed your parachute correctly, if they're going to be honest in a business deal, if they're going to fly the airplane that you're riding in a safe manner? And so we have accepted a lower form of character. Now, I think most of us would say, yeah, but that applies to those people. I'm a pretty good character. And I think what we need to do is look in the mirror and first say, wait a minute, what do I mean? Am I really a good character? Is my character really worthy of what I wanted it to be? I wrote an op-ed about Father's Day last spring, and I got pretty emotional on this one, because every once in a while you'll have someone who described as, well, Stan McChrystal is a despicable person, but he's a great father. And it's this bifurcation where in my day job, I'm Vito Corleone, I'm killing and I'm stealing, but I'm really a good father. I take him to Little League, and I'm part of the PTA and that sort of thing. I would argue that's an absolutely impossible proposition, because children watch their parents holistically. And so you may go to Little League games, but if your kids watch you cheat on your taxes, what they are learning is to be a dishonest person. And so you can't be a good father if you're not a good person. And so that ought to be the kind of thing that requires us to go, okay, let me stop where I am. If I want to be anything, I've got to start with being good character. Now, we're not going to be perfect. None of us.
I was going to ask that. Being perfect is so hard, and we live in such a judgy time. You know, everybody wants to judge everybody else, and they want to do it in 1.2 seconds as well, which is impossible.
That's right.
So, yeah, the character question.
Yeah, we're always going to be making mistakes.
Yeah.
But I do think it's key to realize when you're making a mistake, or realize when you've made one. Every day I make mistakes, and I will tell you, it usually involves how I treat people.
Can you give us an
I'll
example?
be impatient or whatever, and somebody will want something, I'll snap at somebody, or I won't treat them with the respect that they deserve. And instantaneously, I know I screwed it up. If Annie's with me, she tells me about 3 seconds later. But that's valuable, because at the end of the day, I go, you know, I was not that great today. I'll be better tomorrow.
And then what do you do about it?
You start the next day saying, I'm going to try not to do that tomorrow or that day. And that's the best you can do, but there's got to be forcing functions. You've got to be the first one. You look in the mirror and hold yourself to account. And then it's really good to have people around you who are examples of good behavior, or, you know, really close relationships like I have with Annie and with some other friends. People who can look at me and they'd go, don't be such a jerk. And you realize I am being a jerk. And you've got a close enough relationship to them where instead of getting angry, you go, yeah, good point.
Yeah, people you trust, right? They're people you trust.
And society needs to do that. If a national leader gets up and writes or says something that's unacceptable, we shouldn't go, that's their right. We should go, no, you're being a jerk. Stop it. whether we agree with the policies or not.
It seems like we're almost living in a time where you can't do that anymore, because if you criticize a behavior, you're automatically seen to be criticizing the person and everything they've ever done. And I think you're right. You know, you mentioned technology is really amplifying this like rush to judgment. And so I wonder how character is going to survive these rush to judgments if that's what's being rewarded and that's what's dividing the country, which I think it is, personally. I think if we sat down, you could choose anyone you disagree with politically. If you sat down at a table, you would find more in common than more that divides you, is my personal opinion. But how do you feel about that?
Suzanne, I think you've got it exactly right. I think that people are really quick to get defensive, so they immediately make counter accusations or things like that. They'll never take it on board and say, yeah, part of what you say is right, but let me correct part of what you say. Yeah. Instead, what we've learned is to punch back first and punch back hardest. And that does two things. One, it stops that person, and it dissuades others from punching back. Most of us right now are cowered into silence. Mm-hmm. And that is, we know that we'll get a dog pile on social media against us. If you say anything, if you say, I think milk is good for kids, not very, controversial, people will attack you because you're against something else. You don't like orange juice.
Yeah.
Yeah, you weren't even talking about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we won't stand up and be counted. And that's
so your answer is to stand up and be counted, to part of your character being the ability to stand up and say things when they're not popular, or they might be misconstrued, or they might be used against you in ways you've never intended, but you should do it anyway?
Well, my position, but remember, I'm 71 years old. What are they going to do to me now? So I do think you need to stand up and be counted, but when you stand up to be counted, do it in a way that isn't thoughtful. You don't automatically have to say, you're wrong, you're stupid, you should never have been born, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You can simply say, I disagree with that. I have a different view. I respect that you have that view and you probably arrived at it by a rational series of steps. I just have a different one.
Yeah.
And I will respect that you've got that one, but I demand that you respect that I have this one. Now, I know I sound like Pollyanna there, but if enough people talk that way, I think that at a certain time, people get tired of the cacophony of stupidity.
Yes, that's such a great way to put it. I think what you've just described is the difference between hate and discourse, right? It's the difference between where you start the conversation from, if you're out to attack or if you're actually want to persuade or influence or learn or listen. You mentioned, and I know that you are very busy, even though you say you're not. I know you're very busy these days. But before we wrap up our conversation, you mentioned that one of the reasons you wrote the book was to start conversations across the country. Have you been getting feedback from people? And how much are you able to sort of help make sure that people continue to do that?
Yeah, I've been getting great feedback, but not as much reaction by change behavior as I would like. My goal is have conversations about character around dinner tables. Thanksgiving week, it's a great time for them to consider it. The holidays, Christmas coming, schools, churches. It'd be great if they have it in the halls of Congress, but I'm not holding my breath for that. I'd like people at the lowest level in our society just to step back and say, okay, let's just talk about character and see if we can agree that integrity is part of it, respect for other people is part of it, how we treat people outside of our family circle is part of that. If we can agree that there are some things about character that are pretty common, there are also some things about character we'll disagree on, certain issues and more broad. If we can get a core of things and talk about those, then we can sort of start from that position. Okay, we're all Americans. We're all human beings. And you just build from there. And as you say, there's probably more that unites us than divides us. And if you reinforce those first, then you can get to those things that are more controversial.
And that's what I love about this book, Stan. You really, like I said, you're not preaching to people on how to be perfect. That's the last thing that you're doing in this book. What you're doing is you're telling people it doesn't matter sort of where you started. It doesn't matter how many mistakes you've made. There is still an opportunity for you to define, and you should, what your character is going to be, which I think makes it so great. So what's next for you?
Yeah. I don't know. It's funny. I'm in at this incredible point in life where I've sort of had two lives. I've had a military life, then I've had 15 years now starting a company and living. And my granddaughters are getting old enough to be really interesting now. They're 11, 8, and 6.
So they
got
you.
something to say every month. They live next door to me.
Yes, and I'm sure they challenge everything you say.
Yeah, so I get feedback from them on a constant basis. I'd like to help the conversation in America about character. Yeah. I'd like to just push that along. It's time for a younger generation to lead, and I want them to do that. So if people in my generation could be helpful in enabling them to do that, maybe give them a little overhead cover, a little blocking at times, and get them in the positions that they have to assume.
Yeah, I think that's very important, and I think it's fantastic. Not only, you know, what you've done in the military, which wasn't always perfect, it wasn't always easy. We know how complicated, well, you know especially more than the rest of us, how complicated things are in the world and how difficult it is to make decisions. But I really want to thank you, Stan, for all your leadership, both in government and then in the private sector, as you continue to work with corporations and companies at the McChrystal Group on how to establish character within corporations. So much of our future national security is dependent on the private sector as well right now, which is often coming under attack from cyber attacks and other things. So I appreciate your service on both fronts. And thanks for giving us something to really think about that is very personal, not only for you, but it's personal for the reader. And I really want to thank you for doing that. Stan McChrystal, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Suzanne.